The Persian Empire, under King Xerxes I, entered Greece in 480 BC with what could only be described as an army of unimaginable scale. Ancient sources vary, but historians estimate that hundreds of thousands, possibly over 1 million soldiers, accompanied by cavalry, archers, and supply trains, marched south with a singular assumption: sheer numbers would crush any resistance. Xerxes, convinced of his divine mandate and the inevitability of Persian dominance, approached the Greek city-states as if they were mere obstacles, dismissing the strategic value of terrain and the importance of disciplined, localized defense. This was a miscalculation of both scale and psychology that would define the campaign and set the stage for one of history's most famous tactical encounters. Thermopylae, a narrow coastal pass flanked by steep mountains on one side and the sea on the other, was the kind of terrain where the Persian numerical advantage would become irrelevant. Yet, Xerxes' decision-making did not account for this. His generals advised caution and reconnaissance, suggesting alternative routes or the use of smaller, more maneuverable units to avoid bottlenecking the army. Xerxes, however, was blinded by the doctrine of overwhelming force. He assumed that the sheer weight of Persian numbers could steamroll the Greek defenders as easily as rolling a boulder downhill. This reflects a critical error in strategic logic. Numbers alone are not a substitute for understanding terrain, troop cohesion, or morale. In narrow confines, the largest army can be reduced to a series of ineffective, congested skirmishes. The mobilization of the Persian forces itself became a logistical nightmare. Moving hundreds of thousands of men through limited supply routes created chaos before the battle even began. Horses and camels clogged narrow paths, supply wagons stalled, and communication lines broke down. The human element compounded the problem. Soldiers were exhausted before engagement. Morale fluctuated due to confusion, and elite units like the Immortals could not be deployed efficiently. Unlike modern warfare, where logistics are tracked with precision, ancient armies relied on visible cues and written orders carried by messengers. In such a mass, any delay multiplied exponentially, transforming what should have been a show of strength into a vulnerability. Xerxes' arrogance played directly into Greek hands. The Spartan king Leonidas and his small contingent understood the advantage into a near-insurmountable problem. By relying solely on numbers and ignoring terrain, logistics, and the human element, Xerxes set the stage for one of history's most iconic defensive stands. The Spartans, leveraging discipline, cohesion, and strategic positioning, turned the Persian era into a prolonged delay. High casualties for the enemy, and a symbolic victory whose impact would echo for centuries. The Persian failure was not merely a tactical mishap, it was a failure of strategic foresight. Xerxes' mobilization demonstrated that even the mightiest army can be neutralized by intelligence, preparation, and terrain advantage. The narrow pass of Thermopylae transformed the expected flood of Persian forces into a slow, attrition-heavy advance, proving that the scale of an army alone cannot guarantee victory. This episode serves as a timeless lesson in military strategy. Understanding terrain, logistics, morale, and human factors is as crucial as numerical superiority. Xerxes' colossal mobilization, driven by hubris and flawed assumptions, inadvertently created the conditions for a legendary stand. The Spartans' disciplined resistance, combined with the strategic exploitation of Persian errors, ensured that even in defeat, their actions shaped the trajectory of the Persian invasion and the broader course of Greek history. Liking, commenting, and subscribing to Dumb Historian will ensure you continue to explore deep analyses of battles where human psychology, leadership, and strategy intersect to produce outcomes far beyond what numbers alone might predict. The Persian army entered Thermopylae, confident in the superiority of its traditional tactics, massed archers, heavily armored infantry, and swift cavalry charges had secured victories across vast terrains of the Near East. This doctrine relied on overwhelming numbers, mobility, and the psychological intimidation of sheer scale. However, the narrow pass of Thermopylae immediately invalidated these strengths. The coastal corridor was flanked by mountains on one side and the sea on the other, restricting movement and compressing the battlefield. Cavalry charges could not maneuver, archers could not deploy effectively, and the sheer density of soldiers led to congestion rather than coordination. What was designed to be a force-multiplying mass became a liability. Unable to engage effectively without risking disorder or internal casualties, the Greeks, particularly the Spartans, recognized the limitations imposed by the terrain and adapted a formation ideally suited to it, the phalanx. This ancient tactic relied on soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, and long spears projecting outward in multiple ranks. Each soldier protected both themselves and their neighbor, creating a solid, nearly immovable wall of bronze and disciplined muscle. In the narrow confines of the pass, the phalanx transformed into a defensive fortress on foot. Persian archers could launch arrows from a distance, but their impact was minimal against shields held in precise alignment. Cavalry units, expecting open ground to exploit mobility, became stuck in confined spaces where their momentum counted for nothing. Xerxes' generals and commanders recognized some of the danger, but cultural and doctrinal rigidity prevented adaptation. Persian military thought valued the massed force and the intimidation of scale above all else. Attempting smaller, more flexible units would have required abandoning a key element of what they believed made their army unstoppable. The result was repeated frontal assaults into a phalanx perfectly positioned to absorb and repel them. Each attack led to catastrophic losses, frustration among Persian soldiers, and confusion within the command hierarchy. The inability to adapt tactics to new terrain exemplified the dangers of over-reliance on doctrine without situational awareness. The effectiveness of the phalanx in Thermopylae also reveals the power of cohesion and discipline versus raw numbers. Spartan soldiers trained from childhood in the Agoj system, learning absolute obedience, synchronized movement, and trust in their comrades. Each hoplite knew precisely how to hold formation under pressure, how to shield the soldier next to him, and how to thrust the spear at the optimal angle. This level of training meant that even a small contingent could resist forces many times its size. The Persians, in contrast, had units with varying levels of experience and commitment, and the stress of the confined terrain amplified the weaknesses of any less disciplined soldiers. Another critical factor was the psychological shock the phalanx imposed on Persian troops. In open fields, the Persians could overwhelm isolated pockets of resistance with flanking maneuvers or cavalry charges. At Thermopylae, the phalanx blocked every approach, forcing repeated head-on engagements. Each failed assault eroded confidence and increased fear. Soldiers began to experience what modern military psychologists would call learned helplessness, as every advance ended in injury or retreat without tangible progress. The narrow pass amplified the effects of disciplined defense, turning the Persians' numerical advantage into a series of futile, bloody engagements. Xerxes' strategic error mirrors some of the most infamous military miscalculations in history. A parallel can be drawn to World War I, where commanders continued traditional cavalry charges despite machine guns and artillery leading to catastrophic casualties, just as the terrain and technology of the Western Front made massed cavalry ineffective. The geography of Thermopylae rendered the Persian army's massed tactics obsolete. Both cases illustrate how rigid adherence to past doctrine in the face of new environmental conditions can transform a strength into a deadly weakness. Additionally, the Greek understanding of terrain allowed them to implement a force-multiplying effect beyond the phalanx itself. Narrow passages prevented the Persians from using their full complement of archers and cavalry, and the presence of cliffs and rocky slopes meant that any attempt to bypass the phalanx would be physically dangerous. The Greeks could control the tempo of engagement, rotating forces minimally but effectively, and inflict continuous casualties while conserving their own energy. This is a classic principle of defensive warfare. Let the attacker exhaust themselves in a constrained space while minimizing exposure for the defender. Xerxes' misjudgment extended beyond the battlefield. He expected his soldiers to adapt on the fly, relying on numerical superiority to solve tactical problems. Instead, the Persians faced the stark reality of human factors: fear, fatigue, and confusion. The army's size became a liability in narrow terrain because coordination broke down under pressure. Reinforcements arriving late, messages delayed, and soldiers crowded against one another turned the Persian assault into chaos. Meanwhile, the Greek forces, small but cohesive, maintained order and focus, using every inch of the pass to maximize defensive potential. The contrast between the Persian and Greek approaches also highlights the broader principle of flexibility in warfare. The Spartans did not invent the phalanx for Thermopylae, but they executed it perfectly in the context of terrain, numbers, and morale. Xerxes, conversely, failed to modify conventional doctrine to account for environmental constraints. The Persian emphasis on overwhelming force failed because they could not adjust unit formations, distribution of troops, or timing to the narrow geography. Every frontal push was met with the same disciplined resistance, compounding the initial strategic error. Logistical factors further amplified the mismatch between tactics and terrain. Supplying a massive army in a confined pass meant that lines of food, water, and reinforcements were stretched thin. Soldiers at the front faced exhaustion more quickly, while reserves could not deploy effectively. The Greek phalanx, by holding a smaller, concentrated area, required fewer resources to maintain combat effectiveness. This demonstrates the interplay between tactical deployment, terrain, and logistics, a lesson that resonates in military strategy even in the modern era. The ultimate effect of these factors was that the Persian army's technological and numerical advantages were neutralized by a combination of geography, Greek discipline, and failure to adapt tactics. Thermopylae became a textbook example of the limitations of brute force in constrained environments. The Spartans did not need to defeat the entire Persian army, they only needed to hold the pass and inflict sufficient casualties to disrupt the broader campaign. The battle demonstrates that understanding how old tactics interact with new terrain is critical to strategic success or failure. In practical terms, the Persian failure also underscores the importance of integrating intelligence, reconnaissance, and environmental assessment into operational planning. Xerxes relied on assumptions and prior doctrine rather than empirical observation of the terrain and defensive capabilities of the Greeks. The Greeks, conversely, had local knowledge and used it decisively to shape the battlefield to their advantage. The misalignment between expected conditions and reality transformed what should have been a routine engagement into a prolonged, deadly stalemate. The narrow pass turned the Persian army's overwhelming scale into an obstacle, forcing units to fight in tight, constrained formations that negated archery volleys and cavalry charges. The Greeks, by contrast, transformed a small contingent into a force multiplier, exploiting the environment, disciplined formations, and cohesive training. Xerxes' failure to adjust demonstrated the fatal consequences of ignoring terrain, human factors, and adaptive tactics. By analyzing Thermopylae through this lens, it is clear that the battle's lessons extend beyond history into modern strategic thinking. The core principle remains: tactics designed for one environment cannot be blindly applied to another. Over-reliance on previous success, rigid doctrine, and the assumption that numbers alone guarantee victory often result in catastrophic failure. The Persian army's misalignment of tactics and terrain at Thermopylae exemplifies this principle in stark, bloody clarity. This engagement also shows the psychological dimension of warfare. When soldiers cannot maneuver, face impenetrable formations, and witness repeated failed assaults, morale collapses. Even the most confident units lose cohesion when the physical and psychological constraints of terrain are not accounted for. The Greek phalanx turned spatial restriction into a defensive weapon, while the Persian inability to adapt turned their numerical advantage into a liability. Thermopylae demonstrates the enduring importance of adapting tactics to terrain and circumstances. The Persian failure was not merely due to Spartan courage, but due to a fundamental misunderstanding of the battlefield. Compounded by rigid adherence to outdated doctrines, the phalanx, terrain exploitation, and disciplined execution rendered massed Persian attacks ineffective. Xerxes' failure provides a timeless lesson in military strategy. Numbers, technology, or prestige cannot replace the understanding of environment, flexibility in tactics, and human factors. The battle also underscores that preparation, cohesion, and local knowledge often outweighs size and intimidation. The Persian army, vast as it was, could not capitalize on its strength because it treated the battlefield as a generic template rather than a unique challenge. In contrast, the Greeks turned limitations into advantages, transforming their position at Thermopylae into a strategic choke point where the laws of terrain, human psychology, and disciplined tactics converged to neutralize the enemy's superiority. By examining the Persian struggle against new terrain, the critical lesson is that successful strategy requires situational awareness, adaptability, and respect for environmental constraints. The Spartans' victory at the tactical level of the phalanx against the Persian numbers exemplifies how understanding these principles can convert apparent weakness into decisive advantage. It also shows that ignoring terrain, human limits, and tactical flexibility can turn overwhelming strength into vulnerability. Xerxes' reliance on a war of attrition at Thermopylae revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of both his enemy and the battlefield. Convinced that sheer numbers could overwhelm any resistance, he committed wave after wave of his best Median and Scythian troops to frontal assaults against the Spartan-led phalanx. From his perspective, the logic was simple. Sustained pressure and repeated attacks would eventually crush the defenders, and the Persians' vast manpower would outlast the comparatively small Greek force. This was a dangerous overestimation of quantity over quality, one that failed to account for discipline, cohesion, and terrain. The Spartans and their allies were not just defending a position, they were defending a choke point that magnified the effectiveness of every soldier. The narrow pass at Thermopylae meant that Persian forces could not bring their full numerical advantage to bear. Soldiers were funneled into the same constrained space, where the dense formation of the phalanx could meet each wave in a controlled, predictable manner. Each Persian assault faced a literal wall of shields and spears, reducing the impact of massed numbers and creating a situation where disciplined defense inflicted disproportionate casualties. Xerxes' assumption that he could outlast the Greeks ignored the multiplier effect of training and preparation. The Greek soldiers had drilled for years, learning to act as a single organism rather than as isolated units. The phalanx allowed them to absorb attacks and strike in unison, turning each defensive maneuver into an opportunity to inflict losses on the attackers. Even when exhausted from prolonged engagement, the Greeks maintained structure and morale, while the Persians, despite individual valor, suffered chaos and confusion in the repeated assaults. The Persian plan also underestimated the psychological impact of repeated failure. Troops who survived one failed assault were forced immediately into another, creating a cycle of fear and fatigue. The illusion of momentum the Persians counted on was replaced by a growing sense of futility. Unlike the Spartans, who drew confidence from their cohesion and the predictability of their formation, the Persian soldiers faced the unpredictable force of an enemy fully adapted to the terrain. Each failed wave eroded morale, making subsequent assaults even less effective. Moreover, the attrition strategy revealed a misalignment between tactical objectives and strategic understanding. Xerxes seemed focused on the immediate satisfaction of breaking the Spartan line, rather than considering the long-term sustainability of his forces. Every frontal assault depleted the elite troops that would have been critical in later stages of the invasion. While he assumed that numbers could be sacrificed without consequence, the reality was that each loss weakened the operational capacity of his army, leaving reserves stretched and the command structure increasingly vulnerable. The narrow terrain also amplified the Persian failure. In a wide-open field, massed troops could rotate, envelop, or exploit gaps. But at Thermopylae, the narrow corridor funneled soldiers into predictable paths where the Greek phalanx could respond systematically. Spear points projected outward, shields overlapped, and soldiers behind the front line provided both physical reinforcement and moral support. In essence, Xerxes' attrition plan played directly into the Greeks' hands, converting what he thought would be an advantage into a strategic liability. Historical accounts suggest that Xerxes' elite units, the Immortals, repeatedly suffered heavy casualties despite their superior training and equipment. Even these highly skilled troops could not overcome the disciplined Greek defense when constrained by the pass. The lesson is clear. The quality of soldiers, cohesion, and tactical positioning can outweigh numerical superiority, particularly in environments where brute force is limited by geography. The attrition strategy also highlights the danger of underestimating a smaller, highly motivated enemy. Xerxes assumed that his soldiers' numbers alone would instill fear and force the Greeks to collapse under pressure. Instead, the Spartans used the same narrow terrain to psychologically reinforce their confidence. Each repelled wave was a testament to discipline and training, while every Persian casualty deepened the perception that the attacker's strength was irrelevant in this context. This miscalculation was compounded by Xerxes' ego and impatience. Believing that a decisive breakthrough was a matter of time rather than strategy, he refused to consider alternative tactics, such as flanking or deception, until too late, even when presented with intelligence about mountain paths that could circumvent the Greek position. He initially relied on frontal assaults, confident that his attrition plan would succeed. The Persians' rigid adherence to this failing approach magnified losses and showcased a strategic rigidity that the Greeks exploited fully. The attrition at Thermopylae demonstrates a broader principle of warfare. Attacking a smaller, well-positioned, and disciplined force with superior numbers is not automatically a recipe for victory. Numbers must be applied effectively, with consideration of terrain, morale, cohesion, and adaptability. Xerxes' failure illustrates how misjudging these variables can transform overwhelming strength into a costly liability. Finally, the Battle of Thermopylae serves as a cautionary tale about the limits of human endurance in combat. Repeated assaults, the physical strain of fighting in close quarters, and exposure to disciplined defensive formations created conditions under which even elite troops could not sustain effectiveness. Casualty counts rose, not only due to immediate combat, but also due to fatigue, disorganization, and the compounding effects of previous failed attacks. The Greeks, in contrast, used rotation reinforcement from the rear and terrain to manage their own stamina, ensuring that every soldier remained as effective as possible for as long as possible. Xerxes' attrition plan, therefore, stands as a clear example of strategic miscalculation. He treated combat as a numbers game, rather than a complex interaction of psychology, terrain, and unit cohesion. The Greeks' disciplined phalanx, mastery of the terrain, and ability to inflict maximum damage with minimal exposure turned every Persian wave into a tactical defeat, proving that even the mightiest army is vulnerable to superior strategy applied in favorable conditions. The Persian misjudgment of attrition at Thermopylae not only inflicted massive casualties, but also served to galvanize Greek resistance in subsequent engagements. The psychological impact of repeated failures against a smaller force emboldened Greek morale, creating the conditions for later victories at Salamis and Plataea. Xerxes' assumption that numerical superiority could substitute for adaptive strategy ultimately cost him both soldiers and momentum, illustrating the enduring principle that intelligence, terrain, and disciplined execution outweigh raw force in decisive confrontations. In conclusion, Xerxes' war of attrition at Thermopylae exemplifies the fatal consequences of over-reliance on numbers, the underestimation of disciplined defenders, and the failure to adapt to terrain. By sending wave after wave of elite troops into a constrained pass, he created a situation where his strategic advantages were nullified and his army suffered unsustainable losses. The battle provides a timeless lesson in military strategy: numerical superiority alone cannot secure victory when opposed by preparation, cohesion, and terrain mastery. The stand of the 300 Spartans and their allies at Thermopylae transcended mere tactical significance. It was a profound psychological and moral event that reshaped the course of the Persian invasion. While Xerxes' massive army succeeded in physically overwhelming the defenders, the long-term impact was reversed entirely. The Spartans' unyielding resistance became a living testament to courage, discipline, and unwavering commitment, creating a moral victory that no number of Persian soldiers could erase. The significance of this moral victory lay in its capacity to fracture the perception of Persian invincibility. Up to that point, Xerxes' empire had marched across Asia Minor and Thrace with little meaningful opposition. Entire cities had capitulated without resistance, and the scale of his army inspired both awe and fear. The Spartan stand, however, demonstrated that disciplined, well-trained soldiers could resist even temporally a force thousands of times larger. This shattered the psychological advantage that Xerxes had relied upon to intimidate and subdue the Greek city-states. For the Greeks watching from afar, the events at Thermopylae became a powerful symbol of what could be achieved with courage, unity, and strategic discipline. Even those who were not directly involved drew inspiration from the Spartan sacrifice. It ignited a collective spirit across city-states like Athens, Corinth, and Plataea, encouraging them to resist subjugation with renewed determination. Leaders and soldiers alike could now envision standing against the Persian juggernaut, fueled not by naive hope, but by the concrete demonstration of Spartan valor. The psychological effects on Xerxes' own forces were equally telling. Despite overwhelming numbers, repeated assaults against the narrow pass had inflicted disproportionate casualties and delays. Witnessing the unbroken resolve of the defenders, Persian soldiers faced a subtle yet powerful blow to morale. The elite immortals, accustomed to swift victories, were forced into repeated punishing attacks against a small, disciplined force. Each loss, each failure to break the line, eroded confidence and planted seeds of doubt about the infallibility of their king and the supposed inevitability of Persian victory. Moreover, the Spartan sacrifice created a narrative that would endure far beyond the battlefield. Stories of Leonidas and his 300 warriors circulated widely, serving both as propaganda and as a model of civic duty and martial honor. This narrative framed the Greeks not as disparate city-states vulnerable to conquest, but as a culturally and militarily cohesive civilization capable of remarkable feats when unity and courage aligned. The moral victory was thus not just immediate, it became embedded in Greek identity and collective memory, shaping the strategic and cultural decisions of the Hellenic world for decades. The moral impact also extended to subsequent battles. Following Thermopylae, Greek forces were better organized, more willing to coordinate strategies, and psychologically prepared to engage the Persian army at Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea. The Spartans' stand provided a proof of concept that strategic use of terrain, disciplined formations, and the courage to endure against overwhelming odds could disrupt the Persian advance. Greek commanders and soldiers carried this lesson into future engagements, confident that the right application of strategy and moral resolve could overcome the massive Persian war machine. Additionally, Thermopylae's moral victory illustrates the broader principle of the psychological dimension in warfare. Physical defeat does not equate to strategic failure if the outcome galvanizes allies, undermines enemy morale, and reshapes perceptions of strength and vulnerability. In this sense, the Spartans' last stand was a force multiplier, achieving objectives far beyond what their numbers could accomplish. By dying with honor and discipline, they inspired resistance, unity, and eventual triumph among the larger Greek world. The moral resonance of Thermopylae also highlights the interplay between sacrifice and symbolism in human conflict. The death of the Spartans was not merely a tactical loss, but a symbolic act, demonstrating that courage and commitment could impose lasting effects on the enemy's perception. Xerxes' army may have physically advanced, but psychologically, they had encountered a force immune to intimidation and reliant not solely on strength, but on principle. The moral leverage gained by the Greeks was in many ways more decisive than any immediate military victory could have been. For the broader Greek population, the Spartans' sacrifice provided a concrete story of heroism that could be communicated, remembered, and emulated. It offered a moral framework for resistance, even in the face of impossible odds. Disciplined courage and unity could influence outcomes beyond the battlefield. This lesson reverberated throughout Greece, encouraging city-states to contribute to a common defense and to resist the temptation of surrender in isolation. The Persian forces, on the other hand, were forced to reconcile their numerical advantage with the unexpected resilience of the defenders. This created an undercurrent of uncertainty that disrupted confidence in leadership and strategic planning. The belief in inevitable victory eroded, and Xerxes' decision-making began to reflect impatience, rash action, and overconfidence factors that would later contribute to Persian defeats at Salamis and Plataea. In essence, Thermopylae stands as a clear example of how moral courage can counterbalance overwhelming force. The Spartans' stand, though culminating in death, amplified Greek morale, shattered Persian psychological dominance, and transformed a small, doomed defensive action into a defining moment of cultural and military significance. By holding their ground against the impossible, the Spartans created a template for how morale, symbolism, and disciplined sacrifice can shape the course of history even when immediate objectives are not physically achieved. This moral victory also demonstrates the power of narrative in warfare. By turning a tactical defeat into a story of heroism and resilience, the Greeks ensured that the impact of Thermopylae extended well beyond the narrow pass. Leaders, soldiers, and civilians absorbed lessons about courage, strategic patience, and the unyielding spirit, all of which contributed to the eventual coordination and unity necessary for expelling the Persian invaders. Finally, the psychological imprint of Thermopylae influenced not only contemporary battles, but also later historical memory. The narrative of sacrifice and moral triumph served as a model of civic virtue, endurance, and strategic foresight, offering lessons in leadership, morale, and the interplay between tactical action and psychological effect that resonate across time. The Spartans' moral victory underscores that in warfare, influence over enemy perception and the inspiration of allies can outweigh immediate physical outcomes, creating conditions for eventual strategic success. The three-day stand at Thermopylae did far more than merely delay Xerxes' army. It created the temporal and psychological conditions necessary for the Greeks to mount a coordinated defense that would change the course of history. By holding the narrow pass, Leonidas and his Spartans bought invaluable time for the rest of Greece to mobilize, prepare fortifications, and organize a navy capable of confronting the Persian fleet. This interval allowed Athens to evacuate civilians to the islands, consolidate forces, and position its triremes at strategic points like the Straits of Salamis, where their maneuverability would become decisive against Xerxes' massive, cumbersome fleet. The psychological impact of Thermopylae on both Greeks and Persians was profound. For the Greek city-states, the sacrifice of the Spartans became a rallying symbol, inspiring unprecedented cooperation among traditionally fractious polities. The Spartans' unyielding stand reinforced the notion that disciplined, courageous resistance could withstand even the most overwhelming force. It legitimized coordinated military strategies and fostered a sense of shared purpose that transcended individual city-state rivalries. Leaders in Athens, Corinth, and Plataea could now act decisively, knowing that morale and symbolic victories could amplify the effectiveness of their forces far beyond what numbers alone could achieve. On the Persian side, the stand at Thermopylae exposed vulnerabilities in the operational planning of Xerxes' army. The enormous size of his forces, which he had assumed would guarantee dominance, became a logistical liability. Maintaining supply lines and managing morale across millions of troops proved more difficult than anticipated. The failure to swiftly overcome the Spartan defense forced Xerxes into repeated frontal assaults, generating heavy casualties and eroding the confidence of his soldiers. The Persians' perception of inevitability, the belief that their numbers alone could conquer Greece, was irrevocably shaken. This loss of psychological superiority translated into strategic errors, most notably the rash engagement at Salamis, where overconfidence would turn disaster into catastrophe. The time gained at Thermopylae allowed Greek commanders to integrate land and naval strategies into a cohesive defense. The evacuation of Athens, facilitated by the warning and coordination of troops and civilians, meant that Persian forces occupied a largely empty city, depriving them of a decisive prize and forcing them to extend their operations into hostile terrain without achieving their strategic objectives. Meanwhile, the Greek navy positioned itself in the narrow straits, where Persian numerical superiority would be neutralized. The Spartans' sacrifice directly enabled this strategic preparation, proving that the outcome of one battle, even a tactical defeat, could reverberate across multiple theaters of war and reshape operational possibilities. The ripple effects of Thermopylae extended beyond immediate military advantage. The event instilled a narrative of resistance, heroism, and moral courage that unified disparate Greek forces. Soldiers and commanders alike were motivated by the example set by Leonidas and his men, understanding that a smaller, disciplined, and strategically positioned force could influence the decisions of a larger, overconfident opponent. This principle informed subsequent battles, particularly at Salamis and Plataea, where the Greeks successfully executed complex maneuvers that capitalized on Persian overextension and hubris. The Spartans' moral and temporal contribution thus directly influenced the tactical and strategic outcomes of the entire campaign. From a broader historical perspective, Thermopylae marked a permanent shift in the balance of power between the East and the West. Had Xerxes' army advanced unchecked, the Persian Empire could have absorbed the Greek city-states, potentially suppressing the political, cultural, and intellectual developments that characterized classical Greece. The delay bought by the Spartans ensured the survival of Athens and its democratic institutions, allowing philosophy, science, drama, and art to flourish in an environment of relative independence. The Greek victory that followed at Salamis would not have been possible without the temporal and symbolic leverage created at Thermopylae. Furthermore, the psychological dimension of the three-day stand reinforced the strategic value of morale, unity, and symbolic resistance in warfare. The Spartans' refusal to yield, even in the face of certain death, communicated a powerful message to both allies and enemies. Discipline, courage, and foresight could neutralize even the most overwhelming material advantage. This lesson transcended the immediate conflict, informing military thinking and civic identity in Greece for generations. It established a model for integrating moral, psychological, and physical elements into comprehensive military strategy, a lesson that echoed through Western military thought for centuries. The lasting effect of Thermopylae also lies in the narrative framework it provided. The story of 300 Spartans and their allies fighting to the last man became a cultural touchstone, a story of ultimate commitment, valor, and sacrifice. This narrative provided not only inspiration for contemporaneous military actions, but also a moral template for later generations, demonstrating that strategic value cannot always be measured purely in territorial gains or enemy casualties. Influence over morale, enemy perception, and the cohesion of one's own forces can produce outcomes that exceed immediate material calculations. In practical terms, the three-day stand created conditions for operational success that were impossible to achieve without it. The Greek navy, prepared and positioned, thanks to the time won at Thermopylae, exploited the narrow straits of Salamis to annihilate the Persian fleet. This naval victory neutralized Xerxes' capacity to supply and maneuver his massive army effectively, compelling him to retreat and ultimately fail in his campaign. The interdependence of these battles demonstrates the strategic importance of delaying actions and sacrificial stands, highlighting how well-executed resistance can transform apparent defeat into a decisive contribution to overall victory. The moral and strategic lessons of Thermopylae resonate beyond the specifics of the Persian wars. They illustrate the interplay between time, morale, and operational preparation in determining the outcome of campaigns. They also show that even overwhelming material superiority cannot guarantee victory when psychological factors, disciplined preparation, and strategic foresight are effectively applied. The Spartan's sacrifice exemplifies how courage and discipline can magnify the impact of a small force, reshaping the strategic landscape and altering the trajectory of history. Ultimately, the three-day stand at Thermopylae ensured that Greek civilization survived a critical existential threat. The preservation of Athens, the consolidation of Greek naval power, and the eventual victories at Salamis and Plataea were made possible directly because the Spartans and their allies held the narrow pass against impossible odds. This strategic and psychological leverage established a permanent shift in the balance of power, safeguarding the development of democratic institutions, classical philosophy, and artistic achievement. The stand at Thermopylae was not just a battle, it was the hinge upon which the future of Western civilization turned. The temporal, psychological, and moral effects of Thermopylae demonstrate the power of strategic sacrifice by delaying Xerxes' army, inspiring allied forces, and undermining Persian confidence. The Spartans created conditions for operational and cultural survival that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. The narrative of their courage reinforced the unity and resolve of the Greek city-states, ultimately allowing a coordinated military response that saved Greece from conquest and preserved the trajectory of Western civilization. This permanent shift in the balance of power illustrates how even a numerically inferior force can achieve outsized influence through strategic foresight, discipline, and moral courage. Thermopylae became more than a military engagement. It became a symbol of the enduring effectiveness of strategy, sacrifice, and psychological acumen in shaping history. Liking, commenting, and subscribing to Dumb Historian ensures you won't miss the continuation of these deep dives into the battles, strategies, and moments that changed the world forever.